Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session on maximizing social presence with avatars. I'm Mike Howard, product manager for Oculus Avatars, and this is Will Steptoe, software engineer on Oculus Rooms. Now, you may not be aware, but today is something of a landmark event here at Oculus. Arguably, this is the first and probably last time that they're going to let two Brits present a talk. So expect correct grammar, fine diction, and we'll be calling it aluminium instead of aluminum.
Hang on a second, Mike. There you go.
And some of the spelling might be slightly different as well. Like I said, last time they're going to let us do this. So today we're going to talk about social presence in VR, what it means for VR development. We'll then walk through the design of the Oculus avatars and the considerations we made in their design, how we got there, some of the takeaways we've learned from building social VR experiences. And finally, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the Avatars SDK, which we've created to help developers build these rich social experiences in VR that allow people to bring their avatars with them across the Oculus platform. Our goal with working with avatars was to really facilitate the best possible interactions between people, to maximize social presence. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Will, who's going to talk a little bit more about social presence and the roles of avatars in social VR.
Thanks, Mike. So let's talk a little bit about social presence and why it's relevant for avatar design, especially in immersive virtual reality. We're going to discuss the difference between avatars in non-immersive virtual worlds and immersive virtual reality, outline the importance of social presence, and cover some dimensions of what makes a virtual reality avatar believable. Avatars have, of course, been a mainstay of non-immersive media, such as games and desktop virtual worlds, for years now. In non-immersive media, there's a layer of abstraction between both action, or how you control your avatar, which is generally with a gamepad and mouse, and perception, or how you look around and react to the environment and other avatars within it. This is generally on 2D screens with a relatively small field of view and limited body tracking. Virtual reality is different. When in VR, your senses are immersed in a real-time feedback loop, where there is no separation between your tracked body movements, taken to perceive and interact within the virtual world, and your avatar's resulting actions. This is because the same tracking devices used for perception also provide input to drive avatar behavior. So in social virtual reality, avatars are the real-time embodiments of users, and they reflect true body language. Because of the immersive wide field of view display, they also appear at human scale and are seemingly right there, sharing the virtual space with you. So the role of avatars is both to embody users and, critically, to communicate non-verbal behavior. This includes position, identification, focus of attention, gesture, and emotion. The more of these non-verbal channels that we can capture and then transmit and reproduce on users' avatars, the richer and more compellingly social the experience can become. Before we go into social presence, let's recap on the concept of presence in virtual reality. Presence is the overwhelming sensation that the simulated reality you are experiencing is the one that you exist in. Presence is often described as the sense of being there. Presence is what causes you to be nervous when peering over the edge of a virtual cliff, feel claustrophobic in enclosed virtual spaces, or physically dodge out of the way of an oncoming virtual projectile. Social presence refers to the extent to which you perceive other users' virtual representations to be human. So if presence captures the sense of being there in virtual reality, social presence is a sense of being there with others in social virtual reality. The reason that social virtual reality can be so compelling is because it combines high degrees of presence and social presence, as the senses of being in a virtual environment and of being there with other people reinforce each other. Users who are experiencing a high degree of social presence tend to behave and respond toward other avatars with implicit social norms. It's what causes you to maintain a comfortable amount of interpersonal distance with other avatars. It allows for smoother conversational turn-taking through gesture and observation of eye gaze direction. It enables you to recognize someone's mood from their movement and from their posture. And because these are natural subconscious processes of communication, you often won't even realize that you're doing it. So, social presence captures the general sense of believability of avatars and can lead to better communication in social VR. Maintaining the believability of avatars in virtual reality tends to be more fragile than in non-immersive media. This is because we are experts at recognizing human motion, and we automatically assign human qualities and social agency to objects that move like humans. So if an avatar suddenly acts in an unexpected or a robotic way, it can break the illusion of social presence. Avatar design is often a balancing act, where improving on one dimension can have negative repercussions on another and reduce overall believability. One particular case is visual and behavioral realism. Photorealism can actually degrade overall believability. This is because an incredibly detailed visual appearance encourages our expectation for a consistent level of behavioral realism. So an avatar with photorealistic human features that don't move quite right like a human can give the impression of a puppet or a robot, and this can reduce overall believability. As we demonstrated last year with Toybox, avatars do not require high visual realism to foster a compelling sense of social presence. This harks back to the early days of animation, where those few lines that form Mickey Mouse can be just as affecting and believable as the state-of-the-art in computer-generated characters today. This surprising phenomenon taps into the brain's amazing ability to recognize human motion and to fill in the gaps. In virtual reality, it's the tracking data that is used to drive avatar behavior that is the critical ingredient in creating believable avatars. At its foundation, our avatar design is based on maximizing social presence, designing for believability. Our tracking inputs provide the data to drive avatar behavior, and in many ways, define the nonverbal richness of the communication. Social VR is the first medium that presents a shared immersive 3D space where live human movement is reconstructed in real time. We believe that social VR has the potential to approach that gold standard of face-to-face communication. And avatars will play a critical role as we embark along that journey. At each step of the way, it's critical to keep social presence as a principal guide in building effective virtual humans. With this in mind, Mike will now talk about the ground rules that we established when designing avatars to maximize social presence.
Thanks, Will. So Will's just covered a lot of the underpinnings of social presence and virtual reality. Building an avatar system is a significant undertaking, and there have been many different approaches to avatar design in VR as we learn what's most effective and as the technology evolves. There's also a set of stylistic choices that you need to make in avatar design. On the spectrum from cel-shaded or cartoon style all the way up to photorealistic, volumetric 3D geometry, there are a number of trade-offs that you have to make in terms of what you can show, how you do it, and what that means for this balance of believability. So video gaming's already provided users with these amazing experiences that render avatars in incredible detail. And it's pushed towards these expectations of this photorealistic human rendering. But then we've also seen these examples of VR experiences with stripped-down avatars that facilitate great human interaction. There's a lot of decisions to be made here. So with that in mind, our goal with avatars was to provide people with a way to comfortably represent themselves in virtual reality for social experiences. We believe the potential for social in VR is just enormous, and we wanted to provide developers with these avatars that would maximize social presence. So building on these underpinnings of social presence that Will's just spoken about, we came up with the 3 ground rules for our avatar design. The first being, leave it to the human brain. Don't fake it. So we were very clear early on that we wanted to avoid the temptation to add motion above and beyond what we could do with our track data in VR. There's a lot we could fake, from elbows to knees to mouth to eye movement. And this presents an inherent risk sometimes of breaking immersion, depending on your visual style. Even in single-user experiences, the sense of immersion can be broken when you look down and see your own virtual limb positioned in the wrong way. But in social VR, this gets so much more complicated because we've basically lived our entire lives responding to the social nonverbal cues of others. And it's very difficult to have a genuine conversation with an avatar that exhibits these nonverbal cues when they're simulated. At best, they distract from the real movement that the user is trying to convey with their tracked data. And at worst, they get it wrong and they don't match what's being said. A great example of this is mouth movement. It's very possible to map audio capture to the shape of an avatar's mouth and in a 3D representation of an avatar to articulate the jaw. But this presents a number of issues in real social interaction. When we're talking to someone, we take in the minutiae of movement in their face, and mouth movement without, for example, corresponding eyebrow movement can be really disconcerting. The way our mouths move with speech represents this single piece of a very complex facial model. There's emotion. Like imagine talking to someone who is clearly angry at you in the way that they gesticulate, but they have a smile on their face. It's very weird. And there's also this range of expressions that convey just when we're actively listening, and this is a case where there's no input at all in terms of recorded sound. In trying to mimic an articulated mouth for speech, we'd create this expectation of behavior for the rest of the face, and it's very difficult to approximate the rest of that model in a way that feels real, and very uncomfortable when we get it wrong. So faking it runs this risk of breaking the sensation that the person you're talking to is real. Amazingly, we cope very well in the absence of artificial social cues. So in research, we found that with just hand and head positional tracking, users would begin to make much greater use of their hands in communicating, and that the nonverbals associated with active listening were provided through body position, head tilt, and gaze direction. For Oculus avatars, we made this conscious choice to represent everything we could track and avoid adding noise to the quality of the positional data that we're getting from our touch controllers and our headsets. This is obviously enhanced by us doing everything we can to faithfully represent what we capture, which leads me on to rule number 2, which is to show what we're tracking and do it at maximum fidelity. So with early Toybox demonstrations, we found that a couple could recognize one another without hearing the other person speak and without seeing any visual customizations, just based upon the movement of their hands and head. Everything from the way we hold our hands to the tilt of our heads is this amazing giveaway as to who we are. And people who are close with each other can recognize it. Even earlier social VR experiments just had blocks for head and hands. And yet people were still amazingly capable of seeing and understanding the nuance of another human's behavior. It's been amazing to see how sensitive people are to nonverbals. And in relying on nonverbal cues communicated by our positional data, we established pretty early on that we'd need to retain as much of the signal as possible. So early experiments with interpolating across a sample of this motion really resulted in a smoothing of movement that felt artificial and instantly broke that sense that what you were looking at was real. It broke social presence. As a result, we decided, however we implemented avatars, we'd need to be in a place where we could capture the full nuance of our tracking data. The third and final rule is stay humanoid. We've already mentioned that avatars in VR represents this enormous design space. You could be anything. But in designing specifically for social presence, we made a conscious decision to focus on developing these humanoid avatars. The humanoid form reflects the representation of a human user. And perhaps critically, this enables this natural mapping between movement and corresponding visual behavior. If I model a four-armed alien, for example, I'd automatically be breaking rule number 1, regardless of how good my body tracking was. But more than that, the norms around interpersonal distance, as well as the other associations we make when we're interacting with an avatar that looks, sounds, and moves like a human, rely upon that avatar occupying a human volume of space. This has been really interesting, particularly around the sense of one's personal space. And people go as far to feeling harassed when someone else is coming closer into their VR space. We're incredibly sensitive to it. So staying humanoid, at least in terms of the perception of space occupied and those norms associated with it, is really significant for social presence. We're also keen just to make sure we're designing an ecosystem that would work for developers and provide a consistent expectation of the form of avatars in your experiences. Having to accommodate an assortment of body shapes and potentially skeletons would just place this huge burden on developers, or run the risk of breaking experiences for people who'd chosen to embody themselves in one way and couldn't bring that into a certain experience. So we opted to keep our avatars humanoid, And with our visual style, we decided to use rules number 1 and 2 in terms of what we were showing and what we were tracking at maximum fidelity to pull it all together. Taking these 3 ground rules into account, we had this challenge of designing a system that would work with and without touch, for gear and for Rift, in a way that didn't hinder performance. We also needed to design a system that would allow people to personalize their appearance and find a comfortable representation for themselves in VR. And Will's going to go into more detail here.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So, in this section, we're going to go into detail about the structure of our avatars, which operates similarly across Rift and Gear VR. We'll be showing examples from the Rift Avatar Editor and Oculus Rooms on Gear VR, both of which were announced in today's keynote presentation. As we go through this section, we should keep in mind the separation between the structure or morphology of our avatars and their more surface-level visual appearance. We've pursued a visual style that accents human features and form while using abstraction to balance expectations of behavior that we can't faithfully track and reproduce. Due to that separation between structure and style, our avatars would, for instance, also support other visual treatments, such as cartoonish, and the underlying design approach for social presence would still hold. We've broken down our avatars into the different systems they're comprised of, and how we thought about maximizing social presence with each one. We'll start with the overall morphology as outlined in this image. You'll notice that the body occupies a human-sized volume of space, and it does have human features, but they are not fully anthropomorphic, nor do they have a fully visible body. Consistent with our ground rules of remaining perceptually humanoid and only representing what we can track, we show the head and neckline, hands, and inferred ground position. On mobile, we currently only have rotational head tracking, and I'll cover some approaches for bringing in hand presence on mobile later in this section. So as we started to visually diminish a full human body based on what we could track, we arrived on this metaphor of projection. This idea is compatible with our ground rules of only representing what we can track and relying on the brain's tendency to perceive a cohesive whole from the sum of the parts. You'll see that the head is solid, but it fades to transparent, as does the base. We spent some time fine-tuning these transitions, and altering the gradient and position of the neckline fade has a dramatic effect on the impression of body presence. There's a very fine line between a cartoonish blob, someone in a straitjacket, or giving the impression of being unclothed. This neckline transition also provides a great area for customization and personal expression, and it opened up our team to explore hundreds of necklines and fashion items. Mike, did you want to say something here?
Yeah, this is quite funny. So when we decided that we were going to pursue this kind of neckline, we obviously thought, right, wardrobe, clothing options. And I started Googling, shirts and dresses and togas and everything, ponchos, anything I could think of. The repercussions of this is that I still get retargeting adverts for dresses months after this has happened. So I've really confused search engines. But we definitely have covered the gamut, you'll be happy to know.
Nice. So from the base upwards, we also fade from bright to transparent to provide full human height body presence. The base also serves as a very clear indicator of position, where somebody is standing or sitting in the environment, as you can see here in Oculus Rooms, with a group of avatars spaced around the app launching area. Due to this dislocation of the upper body and the base, this allows us to easily support users of different heights without recalibrating the avatar rig. This is also great for transitioning between standing and seated positions. You'll also notice that the form of our avatars is consistent between Gear and Rift, and this idea of projection is what supports that, because it disembodies the body parts. Our projection metaphor is also suited to providing a convincing first-person self-avatar view. Whether you're looking down at your own body or you're seeing yourself in a mirror, the presence of one's own avatar body gives rise to a strong sense of agency in the world. Our avatar's morphology minimizes proprioceptive conflict that can arise from showing a full humanoid body that is posed wrongly. Again, showing less is often more. Self-avatar embodiment helps people judge scale and distance more accurately in virtual reality. Importantly, self-avatar view empowers users as it provides a natural visuomotor feedback loop that allows you to see your own virtual body and know that it's doing what you're intending it to do. So, to summarize the overall body form, we found that this morphology provides a strong foundation for social presence that encourages realistic social behavior and assists in communicating body language. It gives an overall sense of body presence and embodiment while avoiding conflicting information, and it easily supports users of different heights. So, now let's focus on the head and upper body. We have an underlying skeletal rig that allows for soft skinning and thus natural movement of the head and neck areas. This, in combination with the aforementioned neckline transition, increases the ambient liveliness and expression of the avatars over just heads. And this grounds the movement to the full human body. We make use of the positional tracking on Rift, and we drive the rig with the head-neck model on Gear VR. The rig ensures that the position of the avatar's eyes are always co-located with the user's viewpoint, and this allows for mutual eye gaze awareness and eye contact. We also feature a range of eyewear. This was motivated from two perspectives. Firstly, it allows for a variety of customization options, but critically, as our avatar heads tend toward the geometric realism, the presence of eyewear forgives the expectancy for animated eyes, which currently would need to be simulated. Through research, we identified that being able to see the area of the eyes increased the approachability of our avatars and improved social interaction, including the amount of time that people spent in mutual eye gaze. At the same time, people found the concept that the eyes were covered reassuring as it matched the physical reality of wearing the device. So we arrived at semi-transparent appearance for eyewear, which is enough to provide context around the profile of the face, but obscured enough such that people don't perceive lifelessness. For the faces themselves, we work with a team of external consultants to make sure that we're providing a great diversity of sculpts across age, gender, face shapes, and features. As Mike mentioned, articulating the mouth for real-time lip sync and emotional expression, which is usually non-verbal, is challenging to do without a specific capture mode. However, to aid natural conversational turn-taking and general awareness, we found that it was very important to provide a visual indication that someone is talking. We arrived at techniques that abstract away from realistic mouth movement and instead function as signifiers or indicators of talk. These audio visualization effects include material and light treatments modulated by the speech signal. So let's summarize the features of the head. We drive behavior using a rig skeletal model, which grounds head movement to the torso and co-locates camera and avatar eyes to support mutual gaze awareness. The design of eyewear and speech indicators aim to provide customization options and assist with social comfort. A lot of work on refining the hands for touch has been done since we presented Toybox last year. We emphasize the importance of accurate, low-latency tracking and visual appearance to provide a strong sense of both self and social hand presence. From a utility perspective, one thing that we've added is the pinch gesture. This gives you the ability to pinch an object between your thumb and forefinger. We found this to be a really useful alternative to the grip action, allowing you to pick something up to inspect or move it around, versus picking up an object with grip, such as a tool, to use it. The difference between hand input modalities between Rift with touch and Gear VR presents an interesting challenge. Hands are critical for communicational gesture, and touch is ideally suited to that. With Gear VR, however, we only have a small 2D input surface and no 3D hand tracking. So by default, we miss out on that powerful communication channel. So we developed the idea of bringing in hand presence to mobile avatars by having the virtual hand appear with touchpad gestures in a way that mimics the actual performed gesture, as you can see here with a group of avatars playing pairs in Oculus rooms. Because the users are doing the same thing with their hand, the behavior of their virtual hand is truthful. And for social experiences, this provides an effective indicator of another user's actions. In user testing, we've seen that people start to appropriate longer swipe gestures for getting others' attention, and we think it's a neat way of enriching the mobile social VR experience. We also combine this with an interaction ray, which serves to clarify what others are interacting with in the 3D space. And we're also experimenting with fading in your own virtual hand in the first-person view, as you see on the right here. This provides another cue that encourages the illusion of body presence, even on mobile, and agency in the world. So to summarize our avatar hands, we've continued the work presented last year with Toybox to bring both self and social hand presence into Rift with touch experiences, and we've introduced the pinch gesture. For mobile experiences on Gear, we bring in a more minimal representation of the hands in the form of mimicking touchpad gesture. So finally, let's cover materials. Materials define the surface appearance of our avatars. We have a great range of materials available as customization options, each with their own look and their feel. But I'll draw attention to a few aspects of their general design. The first aspect is to emphasize the clarity of avatar pose and position. As you may have noticed from previous slides, a lot of our materials aim to highlight the detail and the geometry, and in doing so, they make head direction, and hence focus of attention, easier to discern. This is achieved by view-dependent highlighting of contours and profile of the geometry, which enhances their silhouette. Our materials also feature secondary motion that plays over the surface of the geometry. This increases the ambient liveliness of our avatars. Like all of our design choices, the primary motivation for this is positioning our avatars as engaging social agents. The next design choice was to avoid materials that look too much like skin. While many of our softer materials could be described as skin-like, none read as obviously human skin. The reason for this is similar to why we don't show nor do we simulate untracked body behavior. It comes close to being you, but it fails, and in doing so, it reduces believability. Another design choice we made was to use a single global color rather than separately coloring the body, clothing, and eyewear. We observed that separate colors gave the strong impression that the facial color was skin tone, and this broke some of the abstraction around avoiding human skin appearance. To make the avatar's components more visually distinct, we highlight or darken the hair, eyewear, and clothing using the same material pattern. So in summary, we've aimed to give people the freedom to personalize their avatars with a gamut of materials and colors. Our materials aim to make it easier to discern an avatar's pose and attention, while avoiding the perceptual problems of natural skin appearance. Our materials provide a great range of options which bring out surface texture, patterns of motion, and other optical effects. So there's been a lot of information in this section, so let's summarize the structure of our avatars. Each of the aspects of our avatar design, from body presence and head accessories, hand gesture with touch and with mobile, and material design, all aim to position our avatars in their role as good communicators and effective embodiments of users in social VR. Layering on top of that foundation, we then provide a vast array of stylistic customization options, so people can find an avatar they really feel comfortable with and which reflects their personality. Now, I'll hand over to Mike to cover some design considerations when building effective social VR experiences.
Thanks, Will. So yeah, I want to touch briefly on some of the insights that came out of the research we've carried out at Oculus around the ways that we can enhance social VR experiences. We spent a lot of time interacting with users with Gear and Rift and Touch, from within environments like Toybox to custom environments that we built purely to facilitate conversation. And we learned a lot about social interaction in VR. I'm going to walk through a few of the lessons we found to be quite useful in maximizing social presence. So today in particular, I'd just like to focus on first-time experiences in social VR. We're all pretty up to speed on the norms of social interaction, and we instinctively move and interact in ways that people understand, except when we're drunk. Caveat. But broadly, we understand the expectations that people have of us during interaction, and we have our own expectations of the people we're talking to, even when they're drunk. So reasonable interpersonal distance, eye contact, active listening, and this mutual participation, these are all really common among most forms of social interaction, and they carry over into VR. At the same time, VR presents a lot of this new visual feedback and a new set of paradigms for interacting with the world. And particularly early on, this can completely overwhelm people. It's pretty common for newcomers in VR and Touch to be distracted. They'll be looking at their hands or just looking around. And depending on the experience, there's a vast amount of stimulus to take in, and most people want to look around and take it all in. As the counterpart to someone who's doing this, it can feel really uncomfortable, really, really awkward, just like it would in real life. So you can imagine if someone was acting like this on a first date, you'd be a little bit worried. So we found that people who are brand new to VR were quick to break the norms of what we'd call good social behavior. And the good news is that this doesn't last long, but people rapidly become very experienced with how to interact more effectively in VR. But it's worth taking into account how we can help them along the way, and we have a few different thoughts on ways we found really effective in doing this. The first is self-reference. So seeing yourself move in VR and kind of appreciating the fidelity of tracking that your head and hands provide really helps to convey this sense of embodiment. Your reflection provides this reference point for what you look like and creates this strong attachment to the reality you're participating in, leading to greater social agency. That's exactly why we've built the Avatars editor with a mirror. It shows full body and tracked inputs. And we've found that once people are very comfortable with the way that they look and move, they feel more empowered to interact more. You should also just think about how you might kind of take this into your experiences. The use of reflection or mirrors, but just light bouncing off things that conveys a sense of movement and enables people to capture themselves in the VR space can really help just embody people into that experience. Hand awareness is equally important to the success of this. As people familiarize themselves with touch, we found that gesticulation and gestures just increase as part of their vocabulary of VR expression. So for me, I spent something like 12 hours talking to strangers in VR, which is a very strange experience when you've not really spent that much time with touch before. And as part of my onboarding, I learned a lot of different gestures and hand expression. And then when I left VR, I just couldn't stop giving people the thumbs up in natural conversation. And you can talk to my team, but for most of the time when we're having conversations, I will sign out with an OK, which is the pinch gesture, by the way. So it really is, it's infectious how you learn these gestures, and they kind of creep back into the real world as well. Touch is this new type of input, and it's the first time most people are going to experience this action-perception loop of moving and seeing yourself move, which Will talked about earlier. And where in the real world you see your hands in your peripheral vision, wherever they are, this is actually less true in VR due to the narrower field of view, especially for people whose default position in social interactions is with their hands at their side. It's just not captured. We saw time and time again, though, that once people became aware of the fact that they had hands in VR and that they could move them at this level of fidelity, their expression and the way they used their hands just increased dramatically. It was almost like they suddenly started using their hands more because they realized they existed with them in VR. This arose sometimes as a result of mimicry, where you'd be talking to someone and they would gesticulate, and you'd see something click, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I have hands. Great, I should use them too. And sometimes it was just as a result of an object being there that they wanted to move. They'd reach out, grab it, and then it would suddenly dawn on them that their hands were in view and that they could use them. But unfortunately, not everyone has their hands in front of them all the time, so it's important to think about this. Most people will suddenly click, and at that point, they would start using their hands more. It's as if they suddenly understand this action perception loop, and they suddenly get that this is just like in the real world. So highlighting the hands becomes a really, really valuable and particularly as a form of expression. And it's very important to encourage using the hands in social settings where appropriate, especially when they might not naturally come into view. You might want to think through how touch and the hands are reinforced in your experience, beyond being a navigation and input mechanism. So finding the ways to bring them into view conversationally, or even through different paradigms within the environment, can actually lead to a lot more mimicry, which can then lead to more social interaction. Finally, it's worth considering some of the forms of group interactions and shared activities and how these can help onboard people into social VR for the first time. So in intimate one-to-one conversation, we're particularly sensitive to the other party and their social cues. But in interactions around a shared focal point, like watching a concert or screening a movie, these require less emphasis on some of the social cues. For example, it's quite acceptable to be looking away from someone when you're at a comedy club or at some kind of concert. But you can still bond with the person over your shared experience, and you find different ways to go back to being social and focus your attention elsewhere. There's definitely a spectrum in terms of the expectation that people have of these different social formats, much like in the real world. And you really want to be quite clear about what type of interaction you're trying to encourage and what this means for your experience. You could do this, for example, with the default distance that you place your avatars apart, the opportunities you provide for social interaction and conversation versus shared attention or activity, and the control you give to all users and the host of the experience, and whether you differentiate between the two. Oculus rooms is a great example. So shown here, the avatars are spaced apart in the TV watching experience in a way that it's very natural to turn and talk to the person next to you. And it's specific to the context of each activity, and players are given the agency to move around the room, and their positional distance changes between the different experiences. It also implements this format really well of different group shared activities. And it's just gear right now, but we found that that friends can spend a large amount of time just hanging out here. And as Will mentioned, they've even developed their own interpretations of social gestures using the trackpad on the side of the Gear headset. So we've spent a lot of time studying how people interact in VR. And we've covered a few of our takeaways, particularly with people who are new to VR. So self-reference, making people more comfortable with their appearance. Hand awareness, bringing the hands into view, highlighting the expression afforded by touch. And the format of group interactions, so enhancing the experience by framing the social interaction appropriately. So now I'm going to spend some more time talking about the Avatars SDK, which we're going to be making to developers at Touch Launch. So as Nate mentioned in today's keynote, avatars are one of the most significant investments that most developers make in building social experiences, and that's especially true in VR. Achieving social presence, this sense that the person is right there with you, requires rendering avatars and solving the networking challenges associated with convincingly replicating their voice and gestures with minimal latency. Our goal with the SDK is to provide you with a way to consistently and comfortably represent yourself across experiences. And to do this, we're providing developers with everything you need to add avatars, whether that's delivering solo touch experiences or adding complete avatars that maximize social presence for multiplayer situations. Moreover, avatars is a platform feature, which means we've built it with developers in mind and performance in mind. So the avatars are incredibly optimized, as are the inputs, without introducing any new control paradigms, except for the motion that you convey and that we capture, and the gestures that we're trying to accurately represent. As the technology evolves and we're able to track more of the real movement and nuance, you can imagine us filling out this projection metaphor with what we can actually accurately represent. This is the first version of our platform feature, and it's going to continue to grow and adapt over time. So at its heart, the SDK provides this renderable representation of a person's avatar. It takes their Oculus ID, and it returns the customized appearance they've made for themselves. Into an experience, we just represent a scene graph, which provides meshes, materials, and the skeleton, posed and animated to match the movement of the tracked headset and touch controllers. And the Avatar SDK is very optimized. We've got custom material shaders in our meshes, which are extremely lightweight for performance and load times. We also included some indicative states, such as inactive or AFK states for when someone's in another experience. One of Touch's defining features is this ability to deliver hand presence, in the sense you actually have your hands with you in VR. And the controllers deliver this through this great ergonomic design, high-quality tracking, and features like capacitive sensors to detect gestures like thumbs up and pointing. But these inputs alone aren't enough to deliver hand presence. The experiences themselves need hand representations that are well-posed, animated, and rendered. And developers also need to make sure that people can use their hands intuitively to interact with the experience. So the Avatars SDK provides a consistent interaction model for interpreting touch controller inputs as hand gestures and actions. If you use the SDK as the basis for your interaction model, it'll be consistent with how hands work across the Oculus platform. And people will immediately and intuitively understand these standardized interactions within the context of your own experience. So out of the box, the avatar hands will articulate and gesture with high-quality interactions like grip, thumbs up, pointing, and, as Will mentioned, pinching, which is really useful for inspecting objects or just understanding the fine control manipulation and dexterity you can get with your thumb and forefinger. The SDK provides support for this library of grip poses for common interactions, like grabbing a pipe or a sphere or a cube, as well as a mechanism for you to assign your own custom grip poses, specifically tailored to the hand interactions needed for your experiences. In addition to this hand model, we're also surfacing as much contextual information about the hands as we can. So, for example, their collision volumes, the direction the index finger and thumb are pointing in. This is really useful in the cases where you'd like to use pointing as an interaction mechanism, for example. Finally, to make tutorials more intuitive, we've included the functionality to show or hide the controllers in the hands, as well as providing calls to display tooltips, which would highlight a specific input or hand gesture. So right now, these are very simple text on quads that pivot accordingly around the hand to make sure that you can see them. But long term, we'd love for this to be extendable to support other things like floating a video interface. Of course, like the networking of avatars is critical. And in order to support this high-fidelity 90 Hz tracking that we've talked about for multiplayer social interaction, we've created a very efficient method of recording and updating the avatar's position and hand poses, as well as the light patterns that represent mouth movement. This is provided with an efficiently encoded binary format, which is easy to incorporate into your experience's own network transport layer. For example, the networking stack that we provide with Oculus Platform SDK. The SDK is designed so you can use each of these components together or independently. So you can use the avatars, hands, and networking as an end-to-end solution for adding avatars to an experience, or just choose to use one or two of these. And our representation is designed to be extensible, meaning you can replace the hand meshes if you wanted to tie in thematically with the rest of your experience while preserving other functionality, or simply just attach your own decorations or accessories on top of the underlying avatar. So that's the Avatars SDK. So today we talked about social presence, the sense of being there with others, and why building for social presence is so important for shared VR experiences. We walked through our approach to maximizing social presence, the components of our avatar system, and some of the ways you can create more compelling social experiences. And finally, we've covered the features of the SDK, which will allow you to bring Oculus avatars into your own experiences. This is from implementing great hand interactions all the way through to fully networked, rendered avatars in social VR. So we believe that VR is going to provide for some incredible and powerful social experiences, with the avatars playing a critical role in how people represent themselves in virtual reality. And we're excited to put the SDK into your hands, and really excited to bring our avatars into your experience. Thank you.